It can be hard enough as a podcaster to consistently produce one podcast, but my guest today hosts 8. Dave Campbell hosts the How To podcast series along with multiple other podcasts in different niches. And because of that, he has a huge amount of insight around podcasting, from attracting listeners to building a real community around your podcast that turns casual listeners into companions that know, like, and trust you. And in this episode, we cover how Dave is able to juggle 8 different podcasts, the 3 elements that make up a true podcast community, how to get your listeners involved in your episode so they can feel a part of your podcast, what podcasters are getting wrong about monetization, the metrics you should be looking at when it comes to tracking success, and so much more. This is an incredible conversation with an experienced podcaster, so if you're looking to take yours to the next level, then keep listening. David, I wanted to get you on the show, as I mentioned, because you have been in the podcasting game for a while, and I think that you'll have plenty of insights for the podcast listeners today. You host 8 different podcasts, which is probably the biggest number I've ever seen anyone host before. And it's not just within the same niche as well. So you've got podcast within the music niche, business, parenting, and then obviously the How To podcast series, which is your main podcast around podcasting. So first of all, how do you do it?
I have more ideas than I have days of the week. So I woke up today to start my day with another complete new project idea, like from beginning to end, everything, the name. I check the websites available. Everything comes to me in like these downloads, which is interesting because we're using podcast terms. But I have, again, just more ideas than I have time. And my wife cut me off at 8, so I have to decide what I have to do next to sneak another podcast onto the list. But I just love every part of it. I love podcasting. I love meeting great people from around the world. And just knowing that I can travel the world with a microphone and headphones.
What was the first podcast you started?
My first one was called the Upcycle Canada podcast. And instead of recycling, what my wife and I do is we upcycle. So we'll take a piano that nobody wants that's going to the local landfill, to the garbage, and we turn it into furniture. So we repurpose things and give it back to people and resell it, keeping things out of the landfill and extending the life of products that people just throw away. So that was our first one. We started that during the global event. And we did that because we had clients and customers around the world who purchased our stuff, and we wanted to stay in touch with them. So we thought a podcast would be the best way to stay in touch during this maybe 1-2 week global event, which turned into something quite bigger. Yeah, so we started that, and that was
I'm all about sort of reusing, upcycling, buying secondhand podcasting gear, things like that, anything to reduce the impact. So that's great. And then how long were you doing that podcast for before you came up with another idea and decided you wanted to start a second one?
We started in our conversations on that show talking to people who do things in the upcycle space as a side hustle. So they have a full-time job and they do this on the weekends, in the evenings. So we got into side hustle conversations, which sometimes had nothing to do with the art of recycling and upcycling. So we're like, now we're starting to break into different content within our own first show. So we started the Living My Side Hustle podcast. And then we started bringing on people who had nothing to do with what we were doing, but did side hustle projects, on their free time. So that became the second show. And then it just snowballed
so
from there.
So it kind of linked in a way. And then I know that the listeners will be thinking, like, it's hard enough to produce episodes every week or every other week for 1 or 2 podcasts, let alone how much you're doing in the podcasting space. So has that been a bit of a challenge? Have you had to sort of cut down or stop certain podcasts to allow other ideas to come through? How have you been able to manage that and keep them consistent?
Yeah, there's some pauses that have happened in some of the shows just due to content or change of focus. The podcasts are still live, active. We do throw up a couple episodes here and there to keep the feed current. But for the most part, I would say out of the 8 podcasts that I have, 7 of them are pretty well always running. So 6 or 7 of them are always running at all times. And then in November, we have a challenge that goes out to podcasters every November that some of your listeners might not know about, where we are challenged through National Podcast Post Month to do an episode every day in the month of November. So 30 episodes in 30 days. They can be short. They don't have to be long. But the idea is that you create an episode daily for the month of November. So in 2024, 3 of my podcasts participated in National Podcast Post Month. So that's 30 episodes each times 3. There's 90 episodes went out in 1 month. So this year, 4 of my shows will be participating. That's 120 episodes just in 1 month alone. So that's on top of my normal everyday things. And I also have a full-time job. As I mentioned, I listen to you at work. You keep me company. So this is all done on my days off and when I don't sleep. So there's a lot of content going out into the world. And again, I have never got to the
Yeah, no,
point
because
where I've
I
run
was
out of
thinking, and I
ideas at
expect
this point.
the listeners thinking like, is this your full time job then, podcasting? But if you're doing this alongside another job,
Yeah.
and yeah, just looking at your feed for the how to podcast series, like you've got episodes coming out every day, every other day. You know, it's not like one a month or something. Whenever you can fit it in, it's a lot of work, isn't it? And you've got some interview episodes, some solo episodes. Yeah, quite incredible. And then alongside that, you also mentioned that you run a community meetup twice a week. Is that for the How To podcast series, or is that just for podcasting in general?
It's based off of the show. So that's where I promote it the most on my podcast. But yeah, I have people who have never listened to my podcast, have no idea who I am, but keep signing up to come to these. And I have, yeah, every Tuesday at this time, every Tuesday afternoon and every Saturday morning, I host this meetup, and it's free for anybody. It doesn't cost anybody anything. There's no sales. I'm not selling anything. We just get together. And a lot of the times I'm actually not even talking as much. My community kind of takes over and they help each other, which is really a great dynamic when you have a bunch of podcasters at different levels, people who don't have a show yet, people who've been podcasting for years, and having them all together in one room on Zoom. It's really quite unique to see what happens.
And how
in
did that start?
conversation.
Because I know they're definitely, like, some of our clients have talked about doing this, or they're planning on eventually, when their podcast gets to a certain size, to start calling out for some people to join a particular community. How did it start, and how did you get those first few members involved?
So for me, when I help podcasters, especially when I help them start a show, part of the planning that we go through when we talk about a new podcast is there's 3 steps I think you need to kind of consider as the host of a podcast. No matter if you're going to turn it into a business or you're just a hobby or whatever. 3 things. First is you have to get a way for your audience to self-identify, to put their hand up and say, I listen to this podcast, right? So that's the first thing. So you got to come up with a way to make it easy for people to do that. If you make it hard, they're not going to do it. So I use SpeakPipe, I use my website, I use my Buy Me a Coffee donation page. These are ways for people to put their hand up and go, hey, I listen to your podcast. That's great. That's the first start. The second thing is to create some kind of feedback loop so that not only do people identify themselves and send you an email or a voice message or donate to the show, there's a part where you actually now have a conversation with them. And you get to talk to them, they get to talk to you. You become more than just the person on the microphone. We're doing it right now. I'm one of your community members on your show. So you're doing this in real time, a feedback loop. Now you're having conversation. You've gone beyond a imagined listener, an avatar, to an actual face and a name. Here's Dave talking to me about my show. So now we're doing this in real time. So you have people identify themselves. I listen to your show. Now I have a conversation with the host. Now I'm in community with the host. But the other part that I think a lot of podcasters miss is how can our listeners talk to each other? So they feel like they're part of something bigger. They feel like they're part of a group, not just one-on-one with the host. And realizing that you like that episode, I like that episode. Now the host doesn't even need to be there, really. We're building community with each other as something in common. And I think in our world today, anybody that can create a space where people can feel like they belong to something, they identify with something, and they have companionship, I think that is probably the thing that people are striving for the most and yearning for is I listen to your show because A, I like you. I love how you do your interviews. I love the questions you ask. I love your voice. I feel like I know you because I've listened to you so much. So any way that I can be part of something bigger than just being a listener, which is great, but can I go a little further in that process? So have them self-identify, create that feedback loop where you're actually having conversations, and then introduce your listeners to each other. Those 3 things together, I think, will make your podcast stand out from
Thanks
all
for
the
that.
other
That makes
shows.
sense. Like, so those 3 things, I think some podcasters struggle with defining whether or not they have a community. So if you've got a few listeners, could consider that a community. Some people don't consider that a community, but with those 3, your listeners can self-identify, you're getting that feed loop, and then they're talking with each other. So without you there, that's when you know that it's more of a community rather than just a one-way street.
And the one thing I get a lot of questions I get is, how do I make money with my show? You probably hear this quite often. And the other one is, how do I grow my show? And when I hear anybody ask me about how to grow my show, I always try to stop them and say, okay, define the word grow. What does that mean for you? Grow your show. And they're like, usually they default to the answer of, I want more people listening to my show. we all want more people to listen to our show. We can help more people if that happens. So I like that. But what if we redefine the word grow to maybe being, how about we grow the depth of our connection with our listeners? Is that growth? You still have the same number of people listening to your show, but you know them better. You've had conversations with them, right? You have a connection with them beyond a listener, beyond a number on a website that represents how many people listen to that episode. I know that Dave listens to my show in Ontario, Canada. That's a different level of growth than just growing the number of people who listen. So that's one thing. What if your listeners listen to all of your episodes and you have 100 episodes, right? They show up on episode 100 and then they listen to episode 101, 102, but they go back to episode 1 and they deepen their growth in what you've talked about on your show and followed you all the way through every episode. Is that not growth? I think that's growth. So when I talk to people about growing their show, I really want them to define, what do you mean by grow? Because for me, I would much rather have a smaller group of people who feel really connected with the show to the degree that they would go back and listen to all the extra episodes from the past, follow the show, be in communication, have them on my screen. That means more to me than hitting some huge metric, which a lot of people seem to gravitate towards. I just love the idea of having a better conversation with my guests.
I give some people to think about, like when they're growing their show. Downloads, it can be like useful to an extent to show sort of general engagement around the podcast, but it can be misleading. Like if you get a big guest on your on one of your episodes and they share it and you get an extra 1,000 downloads, it looks like it's grown, but then are those people actually sticking around, or are they just there for the guest? Whereas if you had a gradual sort of 10, 25, 50 listener growth, but they're listening to every episode, those guests are, far more valuable, listeners, far more likely to take your call to actions and things like that.
Yeah. And I think when we're first starting your show, you need to decide, is this a podcast that's going to be focused on building an audience, getting sponsorships, creating money, like bringing in money for the show? That's a viable path that can be done. And if that's your focus, then focus on that 100% and do it really, really well. But if you're not the podcaster that's initially focused on that, and you want to start a small show and be very niche in your topics and build community, then there's another path for you. There's not just one path in podcasting. So again, if you're going after the sponsorship, then yeah, you need to get those numbers up. You need to build that community. So I'm not trying to deflect from that. I think that's important. But I think the majority of podcasters that I've talked to aren't on the path of making money through sponsorships for their show. That's not their intent. So how do we help them?
So are some of your podcasts monetized and some of them are more as hobbies? Is that right?
I would say that, well, again, the topic of monetization is another interesting thing as well, because some people default to the fact that monetization means commercials, right? Somebody's going to pay me to talk to my audience so that they can sell a product or a service to my listener. So that's one component of monetization. I have my Buy Me a Coffee that I set up about 7 months ago, and people donate to the show. So they buy coffees, and what I do, because I have a full-time job, technically I don't really need the income from that, but I use my Buy Me a Coffee as a lever that I use for engagement. So when somebody says, I like the show, I like everything you've done, I'd like to say thank you. It's like a glass of water at a job interview. They always offer you a glass of water. It's just kindness. People want to be kind back to the people they connect with. So I just put it out there. I don't really make a big scene about it, but it's there. And over 7 months, I've had over $7,000 Canadian donated to my show, which is quite substantial when you're like, wow, that's a good response. So, and then what I do is I take that money and I reinvest it in podcasters. So I help them set up their Buy Me a Coffee when they're a new podcaster. And then I tell them, I want to be your first donation. I want you to see that email. What it feels like when somebody says, I love your show, I love what you're doing, here's a donation. So I want to be your first donation. And then I also help them with their SpeakPipe. SpeakPipe.com, you can get voice messages. People can leave you a message and it comes right to you in an email. So I've heard from my audience. I have 3 voice messages have come in the last year and a half from my listeners from around the world. So I bring their voice onto my show. So they have a question, a comment, anything, I'll actually include them in the podcast. So the joy for them, their voice shows up on their favorite podcast. And they're like, oh my gosh. And you know what they're going to do? They're going to share that with people. I was on Joe's podcast. I left him a message and he played it on my show, on his show. I'm going to tell everyone. Even if they don't know what a podcast is, I'm going to tell everybody because my voice is on the show, right? So it's a really fun experience to do that. And it's part of the I self-identify. It's part of the feedback loop. It's part of the whole community building side is that engagement piece. So I want to be somebody's first voice message and I want to be your first donation. And that's kind of how I start out.
Yeah, you know, you're in a good place when you start with some monetization option like buy me a coffee and kind of jumping to get involved, like because they've felt they've already gotten so much value that any kind of donation or anything, you know, they feel bad not donating by the sounds of it.
And what's interesting too is the camera I'm using right now today came from a listener in Warsaw, Poland.
Oh, wow.
He bought me this camera. After 100 episodes, he listened to my show. He's like, we got on Zoom together. He used my link on my website, and it's a free calendar link. He jumped in, and I didn't even know who he was. And he's like, David, I've been listening to your show. I want to give you something. And I'm like, oh, he's going to give me feedback. What are you going to give me? He's like, what kind of camera are you using? I had a cheap camera at that time. He's like, can I buy you a camera? Like, you want to buy me a camera? So he bought me this camera. And then I had another listener who said, Dave, you mentioned that your computer was giving you a hard time in an interview and stuff. Can I buy you a new desktop computer? Can you buy me a new desktop computer? Let me think. Okay. So it arrived at my house. I have a new desktop computer and a new camera from my listeners on top of the donations that have come into my show. People want to do nice things for people. And if you show up as a podcaster without the intent of, I'm going to milk this for as much money as possible, people are going to hear that in your tone and your content. You come up and just serve and show up for people. It's one thing interesting, Joe. I had somebody reach out to me recently and they said, I listened to the How to Podcast series, but I have no interest in ever starting a podcast. And I'm like, oh. And he said, but I want you to know, I listen to your show because of you. I listen because of your voice. You keep me company. And there's days when I just need a familiar voice. So you could talk about anything. You could read to me ingredients off a menu. I would listen to you talk. So thank you for your show. Thank you for what you do. Again, I'm not going to start a podcast anytime in the future, but they just don't stop podcasting. And I'm like, what a weird message to get. Because when I first started, I struggle with my voice. I struggle with how I sound. Am I going to be good at this? Is this ever going to land with people? But when somebody tells you, Joe, I really don't care about your content, but I just love listening to Joe, right? It's a very interesting feeling. And that's the kind of connection I hope for everybody.
Yeah, I guess, because as I mentioned about like monetized podcasts versus hobby podcasts, it's kind of a lot of what you're doing isn't really any different because, like you say, if you're coming at it from an angle of monetization that you want to milk your listeners for everything they're worth, then not going to work anyway. So would you say there is any kind of difference if somebody was going to start a podcast as a hobby or as part of their business, whether that's to bring in new leads or make money directly from subscriptions or advertising? Would you say there is any kind of different actions or different approach that you'd expect the podcaster to take?
Well, like, for example, if we talk podcasting in business sense, I would say let's give an example of a real estate agent. If a real estate agent had a podcast about a community where I'm thinking about moving to, I would listen to their show because they could cover things like how much your house is selling for right now. What's a good neighborhood in this community? What are there things to do in this community? And the moment I arrive in town or before I even move, the first person I'm calling to buy a house would be that real estate agent. Now, if that real estate agent made from commissions of a sale where I've hired them because of their podcast, I would think that would be enough to justify the cost of having a podcast. Because now you have a new lead who didn't know about anybody else. No one else in your city is doing a podcast about your city as a real estate agent. So you're the only person I'm going to look for when I move. So you could make money supplemental to your podcast, not direct donations, none of that stuff, just because you're an expert showing up in the space. A coach, a doctor, whatever you are, whoever you are and what your service you have, your podcast could be the door to the service that connects the listener to come and use you first. So if I have 30 real estate agents to choose from and I'm moving to a new city, if they have a podcast, I know, like, and trust them before I've even met them. I'm pretty well guaranteed I'm going to call them first. So your podcast can generate income outside of traditional advertisements and all of that, just simply in the fact that you're a trusted voice.
For the most part, for most podcasts, it's really just about giving as much value as possible to the listener rather than anything else, whether you're monetizing or not. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say value and companionship. I think we're starving, Joe, for a trusted voice who shows up on a regular basis where we can build our life around them and listen to them. Again, to the person who listens to my show who has no idea or no desire to start a podcast. They build their world around me, and I'm part of their day because I show up on a regular cadence. So that regularity, I think, is really important. Not so much to check off a list of I was a regular contributor as a podcaster, but the fact that I build my world around you, and I have a certain spot in my week where I listen to Joe's podcast. And when it's not there, I'm disappointed, and I'm worried about you because you've been there so much in the past. So I think when people fade away from their podcast and quietly quit their show, that's when people get nervous. As a listener, they're like, I hope Joe's okay. Like, I've been listening to him for years, and now he's not here, right? They want to check up on you. So there's value in the content, but there's also value in the companionship that you bring to people. And I don't think a lot of people understand that. When I first started my shows, I wasn't thinking that people would build me into their life, but they do. And there's a kind of a, I feel like I'm committed to them in that relationship, to do my part to show up for them as often as I can. So 2 of my shows release 3 times a week. So there's 6 episodes go out every week just on my 2 podcasts alone. And that's the cadence I've set up. And I have people who show up on a regular basis just because they built me into their podcast. So every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, there's a new episode from Dave on those 2 different shows.
Yeah, I think even big businesses don't really understand this. So they don't sort of get that, what you're saying about the companionship and the trust. They're still thinking about it from a purely marketing perspective, you know, that in their author section on Spotify and their title, they've got their brand name rather than the name of the person who's hosting it, and it's all very branded. And it's like, if you could understand that you can actually, as a brand, you do podcasting the right way and you make it personal and you make it about that connection, you can build companionship. Like you say, it's sort of that podcasting's like that ultimate final level of trust that you can form with someone, because you're spending so much time with them each week. It's on a whole other level than short form content and ads and things like that.
And in comparison to social media, in comparison to you, to TikTok or all those other places, try reaching out to those creators and see how long it takes to hear back from them. It's not the same thing, right? You can have your favorite YouTuber with millions of listeners. You send them a message and see how long it takes them to get back to you. Your favorite TikToker, and you've liked every single one, and they got millions of views on their TikTok. Send them a message, set your stopwatch, and tell me how long it takes for them to get back to you, like in a meaningful way. I've tried. I've never had a response from anybody to date. Then I love their content. I love what they do. I want to encourage them. I want to say thank you. I want to support them. And I'll send them messages of encouragement and appreciation. I don't hear anything back. I do that to a podcaster, and bam, I get an email. I'm getting a voice message. I'm getting content. I'm like getting contacts from these people that I love and admire. I get to go on one of my favorite podcasts. I get to come on Joe's show. Like, talk about the connections that can be made in podcasting. I think it's a different level than what we see in social media and on YouTube.
And just touching on a couple of points that were interesting that we didn't cover yet, or maybe we could cover a little bit more. You mentioned about SpeakPipe, and I think a lot of listeners, they won't be aware of this. And it's definitely something that if a podcaster wants a little bit different or get their listeners involved. So how does it work exactly for anyone who's not aware? What is SpeakPipe and how do you set it up and vision sort of making that a part of your podcast every?
Sure. Yeah. So I don't make any money from this. I'm not sponsored by them at all. I just love their service. Because just going to put that out there.
No, I'm sure there are other options.
I'm not making any money by recommending these people. Speakpipe.com. Yeah. So speakpipe.com is the website for this. And on speakpipe.com, you can sign up and get a free plan. You are limited to, I think it's 90 seconds at the time of our recording, Joe. About 90 seconds that people can leave a message, and the recording stops. So if you have 3 minutes of content or, comments, it just cuts you off. You can use it multiple times, but they get a 90-second limit. If you use the paid version, I believe you get up to 5 minutes of recording time per message. So I was using the free version, and I was getting frustrated comments from people leaving messages going, Dave, every time I use this, it gets cut off. So I went to my podcast. I said, everybody, I love that you're using SpeakPipe, and I've had some messages saying that you'd like it to be longer recording time. It costs money to do this. I don't have the money to put into this. If you're interested in increasing the length of time, you can leave messages on my SpeakPipe. I would love for you to go to my Buy Me a Coffee and donate, because then I'll take the money from that and pay for SpeakPipe. And you know what happened, Joe? My audience stepped up and said, we'll take care of that for you. So I don't have to pay for SpeakPipe. It's paid for by my audience through my Buy Me a Coffee. They pay for it. So now I have 5 minutes maximum per message. It's available on my email signature. It's available on my website. It's available on my social media. I'll do links in my stories on Instagram, including my SpeakPipe link. And I just put it out there. It's like fishing. The more lines you have in the water, the more fish you can catch. So don't just go with one line and go fishing and hope for the best. Throw a whole bunch of lines out there. You're going to have the potential to catch more fish. So I use SpeakPipe then. And what happens is I get an email comes back to me. I don't know which particular podcast they're responding to because I have 8. So I don't know. But I get this email and there's a voice. So I'll give you a story because everyone likes stories. I have a show called the Podcast Editing and Support Show. I created it because it's a show to help podcast editing people to find podcasters to work with and a podcaster to find an editor. Because, we can go to these websites and hire somebody and hope for the best, or we can do a planned out approach and hire the right person to edit our show and support us as a podcaster. So it's a new show. It's been out for a while. And I noticed in my stats that I had a new listener in a certain city in Germany. They listened to the last 5 episodes. They didn't listen to all of them, but they've listened to the most recent 5. And it's that specific city, and it's one listener in that city. So looking at my stats, I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna try it. So Joe, I started my next episode. I went, welcome to the Podcast Editing and Support Show. I just want to say I have a new listener in this city in Germany. Just noticed you've been listening to the last 5 episodes. I just want to say thanks. Like how you found me, I don't know why you're here. I'm glad you're here. I'd love to meet you. I'd love to hear your voice. And so there's a link in my show notes. Go to my SpeakPipe and just let me know who you are. But thanks. And at the end of that episode, again, I came back and said, yeah, before we go, thanks for being here, everybody. Thanks for listening to the show. And again, to the person listening in Germany, at this city, thank you so much. I'd love to hear your voice. 3 weeks later, here comes an email, Joe. And it just says email and SpeakPipe link. And I can click right there in the email and I can play it. I can also download it. But I click play and I hear a little chuckle. And a person goes, hi, my name is Simit and I live in Germany. I live in the city that you talked about. And you called me out. I wanted to say thank you. I listened to your show. And he's kind of laughing and you can hear it's kind of fun for him to do this. And he just said, I just want to say thank you. I'm the person in Germany listening to your show. Joe, that moment takes me beyond recording a podcast, talking to a monitor screen by myself in my house, to I now have a new friend named Simit in Germany who listens to my show. So I've gone beyond creating a avatar, an ideal listener, to Simit. I know the name of my listener. So I don't need the avatar as much because now I know who I'm talking to. I'm talking to Simit. Every episode, I'm talking to Simit. So that's such a great thing. So having a tool like SpeakPipe gives your audience the opportunity, it's free for them to use, to come in, leave you a message, leave you a comment, a question, and again, self-identify and start the feedback loop right there through SpeakPipe.com.
Yeah. So if anyone listening is trying to think of getting more of their listeners involved, or maybe finding out who's listening in Germany or wherever, then SpeakPipe is an option. I mean, there are other things that people try, like reading out reviews, for example. It's kind of a simple way of getting people involved, like, and also another way of getting more reviews for your podcast. But if you're actually their voice on your show, that could be quite a value add and just adding to that community aspect as well. And then as well, you mentioned about your listener paying for it. I think it helps because you came from such a genuine place. It was like, I genuinely can't afford this right now because the show doesn't make a huge amount of money. But if you like, you can donate. And if you don't want to, that's fine. And then I think that makes it a lot more of an incentive for people to help out rather than just, sticking an ad at the beginning, like, please send, pay however much a month, or, making it more of an ask, sort of, if you like. Okay. I just want to ask you a couple more questions, if that's okay, before we wrap this up. Just going back to the 8 podcasts, because I feel like this is a really really interesting aspect of what you're doing. Are there any that do you have like favorites? And are there any that kind of light you up more than others, or have you ever felt like maybe I should change this one or stop this one to make room for one of these other ideas in my head? Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Well, it's kind of like picking your favorite child. It's really hard. I like my Living the Next Chapter podcast. It's an author podcast that has 520 episodes.
Wow.
It'll be 3 years in February. So yeah, this month. So that's 520 episodes. That's a lot of content in 3 years. That's a lot more than normal. That's more than one episode a week, right? I've had Hollywood actors on my show. I had a survivor of the Holocaust on my show recently. He's 99 years old, I believe. He just wept as he told the story of his family escaping and finding a new life in America. And I'm just like, oh, like just the legacy of having that gentleman on my show and talking to somebody with firsthand knowledge, like what an amazing story, right? And I've had children on my show. I've had people from all different walks of life and all different communities that come on my show as authors. And we celebrate them. And the interesting thing about that show is I'm not an author. I've never written anything. And I'm the host of the show. So I come with a different perspective where other author podcasts are hosted by an author, interviewing an author. They don't seem to explain things very well because they're both authors. Where I, as a non-author, I get to stop my guests and go, wait a minute, what was that? How did you do that? I don't understand how you do that. I've never done this before. So in that moment, my listeners go, yes, finally, somebody's answering the question about how to find somebody to do the cover of your book. I don't know how to do that. I don't either. So my listeners for that show are new authors just starting out. They don't know what they're doing. They're looking for experts, somebody, another author they can ask questions from. So I represent them, but I also represent the readers who never will write a book, but just want to fall in love with an author. So that's my approach. Very different than all the other author podcasts about how to write a book and how to write this and how to do that. It's really more about the author. So I love that one. That's probably one of the ones I do the most. I do about 20 to 25 guest interviews and pre-interviews a week on top of all my recording and editing and working. So that's what I do a lot of. Today I have 7 different interviews that I'll be doing today and conversations I'll be doing. So that one takes up a lot of time. That's a lot of fun. How to Podcast series is great because I bring people on as guest co-hosts, not interviews. We have a conversation together. It's not me asking you a bunch of questions. It's you and I having a great conversation to help podcasters. That one I love. I do love my music one. I've been doing music for 45 years, so I get to talk to musicians who do stuff that I do. So that's another fun one for me. There's just so many different things. And I feel like somebody said that I'm a multi-potentialite. And I'm like, wait a minute, was that, you just called me a name? They're like, no, multi-potentialite, meaning that I just see potential and I just see all these different things that interest me. And I'm not just hyper-focused on one thing. I'm always kind of spinning these plates of all these different interests. And for some reason and somehow I can keep them going, which I love. But I just love meeting new people and building more community. And my goal for 2025, Joe, is to collect as many people as I can. And by collecting them, I mean collect relationships, new contacts, new community, make my world bigger, make my world better by sharing people's voices on my show, giving people a platform they've never had before by coming on my podcast, and just building connections. Like now I have you in my life. Like, again, I listen to your show and now I have time with you. This is exactly my path in 2025, is to meet as many people as possible and to encourage as many people as possible. It's
yeah,
really
I can
my
understand why podcast would be one that stood out when I asked, like, maybe it's not your favorite, but one that made you feel the most is always going to be the ones that sort of are closest. And also you touched upon a good point that a lot of podcasters, that they're not the expert in that particular space, but you don't have to be. Like, you're not the expert in that space, but you're a facilitator, and you made that conversation happen. You brought that conversation to life with the Holocaust survivor. People wouldn't have heard otherwise. So that's still incredible.
So one thing that just happened to me last week, Joe, which was really cool. A lot of people talk about, for podcasters, it's like, how can I be found? How can people find my show? And the whole thing around being found and being search engine optimization, you talk about on your show a lot. And I love those episodes. And the one thing that happened for me, for my How to Podcast series, I named it that for a reason, because that's kind of how people approach a search engine. When they go to Google, they go to Apple, they go to Spotify, they type in like, how to podcast. And I had somebody go into Apple and they typed how to podcast. And the first result that came up on their screen as a new podcast listener was my show, the How to Podcast series. This person is a teacher. And I live in Ontario, Canada, near Niagara Falls.
Yeah.
They live in Vancouver, British Columbia, on the other end of Canada. They're a teacher that teaches a grade 6 classroom, all-girls school, 22 students, and they're doing a component on podcasting. And they invited me to virtually come into the classroom on their big screen in the room and address 22 grade 6 girls around the power of using their voice in podcasting, how to do it, and answered questions from the class. I did some little lessons and stuff. I was there for an hour talking to these amazing students, all because the name of my show was easy to find. It was something that somebody would naturally search for when they're going to do a search about my content. It was found on Apple, followed up by, and then I was able to have my community. Remember we talked about those 3 points? Self-identify, feedback loop, and community. All of that happened within 2 days. She found my show. I had a pre-call with the teacher. We planned out the core class. And then 2 days later, I was teaching the class. All within, I was Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday last week. So you can be found. If I had a show, Joe, called the Dave Campbell podcast, nobody's searching for the Dave Campbell podcast. As much as I would love them to, nobody really cares to search for that. But the How To podcast series is something that somebody would naturally be interested and curious about. So when you're naming your show, for anyone listening, and you're like, I'm not sure what to call my show, remember, nobody cares about the Dave Campbell podcast because I'm not famous. And that was one of the questions the girls asked me, are you famous? I'm like, no, I'm not famous. But come up with a name for your show that people would naturally search for. That's one way to be found. And then when somebody reaches out to you, just before we got on the call today, Joe, I just had an email from a listener. They gave me this big spiel about how they want to create their show, how they want to do. I have no idea how to do this. Here's what I'm thinking. Can you help me? I've already responded and emailed them back. It was like 5-10 minutes after they emailed me. That kind of connection and community. People, when I first put out my call for people to leave me a SpeakPipe message, I remember somebody reached out to me and they said, after about the 15th time they heard me say that, they're like, fine, I'll give you a try. Most people aren't going to respond, but I'll do it. I'll leave you a message. And 5 minutes after their message came in, I left them a voice message back. And they're like, oh my gosh, he's real. This is a real person, right? He said, do the thing. I did the thing. And he responded. So when you have this podcast platform, remember, you have a commitment to an audience. Again, looking for companionship, looking for somebody that they can fall in love with and kind of be part of their community and part of their life. You have this platform. Don't let it fall apart. Follow up with your people. Be available as you promised, and build that community one listener at a time. I can tell you, the depth of community that I have through my show, you can tell I'm passionate about this show. The depth that I have of community that I have around my show is the reason that I keep podcasting.
Nice. And it's these little things as well. I'm sure you mentioned to your clients as well. And it seems like a small thing, like how big, how much of an impact is the name going to have? But like you said, this unity about just because you followed sort of best practices podcast name, SEO and things, and then also the way you do every little thing, like the speak pipe. It's not like an automated AI response. Like you could get through these probably much quicker if you didn't have to record a response or personal email back when someone records it. But then they'd probably feel like it wasn't really worth recording a message, and they'll be less likely to recommend the podcast, and all these little things add up, don't they?
It's amazing. So if you're listening to Joe's podcast and you're like, I'm thinking about starting a show, then obviously reach out to Joe because he's going to be a great resource for you. And listen to every episode. Go back to all the way to the beginning. Listen to them all. And one thing I always encourage my listeners to, Joe, is to listen to the entirety of each episode. It's a great flag to whatever app you're on, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, that every time that somebody comes to Joe's podcast, they don't listen to just the first 5 minutes. They listen to every episode to the end. So I always celebrate my listeners at the end of the show. Thank you for listening to the entire podcast, because it's a flag to Apple. Every time we send them to Joe's show, everybody stays. So this must be a good show. Apple's going to naturally want to make more people come to your show. And then if you come to a different podcast and everybody leaves 10 seconds after they press play, Apple's like, that's not a good experience, and we want people to be here longer. So we're going to reward the people naturally, just makes sense, that come to a show and stay to the end. So for you, as you listen to Joe's show and you think, well, it's not that important. As you listen to Joe's show to the end of every episode, he's naturally going to be celebrated on every app, YouTube, everywhere that he is. It's naturally going to happen just because you listen to every episode. There's another growth hack for your show. When we talk about growing your show, get people to listen to the entire episode. That's another way to grow your show. You didn't get a new listener, you have a dedicated listener who comes and listens to every episode. So when I listen to your show, Joe, even if I'm going to break or it's the end of my shift, I always come back and finish the rest of your episode because I want Apple and Spotify and all those apps to know that your show is a great show for people to come and find. So that's my role as a listener. I listen to every episode you have, all the way to the end, every time.
Thank you. Thanks for the shout out and also for listening. But for anyone at home, I do recommend that you go and check out the How to Podcast series. There's a huge amount of content on there for anyone who is running a podcast or is just in the process of starting one. We're on episode 379 now, and there's a lot of solo episodes as well, and some shorter ones and some longer ones, and touching on a lot of things that we haven't haven't touched on in this podcast yet. So self-doubt and imposter syndrome, things like that. So I do recommend checking that out. And then, is there any else you'd like to send the listeners today at all? Maybe if they want to check out some of your other podcasts.
Sure. Joe, thank you so much for letting me come on. I love this. TrueMediaSolutions.ca, because I'm in Canada. TrueMediaSolutions.ca is the home for all of my podcasts, whether they're my shows or the shows that I work on for clients. So that's where you can go. There's a button there that says Our Podcasts, and you can find all my different shows right there. And again, one thing too, if you're listening and you have a podcast and you're looking for a way to share your podcast with the world, try a free website called pod.link, pod.link. Search for your podcast, and it will give you shareable links to your podcast as a whole or the episode specific. And you can share the specific episode link with your guest. But it gives you a list of all of these different apps where you are on. So you're not just giving an Apple link. You're not just giving a Spotify link. You're giving choice to your audience to pick the app that they want to listen on. So it's free. It doesn't cost you anything. Pod.link is a great way to share your podcast with your guests, with your community. Put it in your stories on Instagram. Post it everywhere. It's a great way for people to find your podcast, no matter what app.
We'll put a link to SpeakPipe and to Podlink in the show notes as well if anyone wants to try it, and also to TrueMediaSolutions.ca if you want to check out any of Dave's other podcasts, or just to have a look what it released many podcasts on the go. But yeah, thank you again for spending just under an hour with me. I really appreciate your time, Dave.
Excellent, Joe. Thank you for your show. Thank you for all you do. And to your listeners, it's great. Make sure you follow Joe and do all that great stuff behind the scenes. Support Joe's podcast. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks for listening to Podcasting Amplified. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. We'll be back next time with another conversation offering more insights to take your podcast to the next level and help you to achieve success. Happy podcasting.